Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. I'm a psychological astrologer as well as an analytical hypnotherapist. And today I am joined by Michael Bartlett, who is here to talk about esoteric rulerships. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Anna. How are you today?
Very well. And I'm so happy because this is a subject that we haven't had on Lightways before. So let's begin with the obvious question. What are esoteric rulerships?
Well, I think we have to even take maybe a step even before that as far as what is esoteric astrology, right? I mean, there's like not many people practice it. Many people don't even understand what it is. Esoteric, I'm also like a 12th house person. So, and I have Saturn and Pisces. So I've got all these themes of like, the hidden, the ancient mysteries, right? It's kind of like what we're talking about in a sense as well, right? So we, with esoteric, we're basically considering the works of Madame Blavatsky, who very, very thinly and lightly outlined something. And it was really Alice Bailey who brought forward with Dwal Kul, or DK as they like to call him, the master, a book called Esoteric Astrology that you can get from Lucius Trust, Lucis. It's interesting because there's just so much back in it, because Lucius comes actually from Lucifer, which many people have a very charged reaction about that because, many people see that as the devil. But Lucifer was just basically the one who fell out from the light. He was the first one to kind of call God on his stuff or her stuff, and so, the bringer of light. And so bringer of awareness, it's almost like when we go back to talk about Eden as well, right? Eating of the apple is bringing us awareness to ourselves. It's not a sin. It's just meaning that we're being aware that we're this physical form that's going on. Anyway, so it's all cool. And Alice Bailey did this work. This book is called Esoteric Astrology. And what I really love about it, it's a whole different viewpoint of looking at astrology. When we think about traditional astrology, which is what most of us practice, from the esoteric standpoint, we call that personality-based astrology. So it's more like what am I doing out there in the world? How am I going to be interacting with people? It gives you some clues and some insights as far as your spiritual content. But when you start stepping into this place of where one of the sayings in esoteric astrology is, or in esotericism, is being, my mind just went blank, it's being neutral to the transcendent and being personal to the impersonal and personal, being personal to the impersonal and impersonal to the personal. So, which, when we think about Pluto and Aquarius, it's a really great timing for understand that it's this ability to kind of step out and from ourselves into a larger viewpoint and seeing things and not taking ourselves so seriously. Something that humans really need to learn how to do. I think we become so precious unto ourselves that we kind of forget our place in the grander scope of things. So the book has a series of information on esoteric astrology, and one of the key things that I really enjoy about it are what you talked about earlier, Anna, the esoteric rulerships. So when we think about the traditional rulership of Aries being Mars, the esoteric rulership is Mercury. And so it's really kind of neat when you think about it, because what we talk about with Aries a lot is, where angels fear to tread, right? It's that impulsive, instinctual Mars energy that's like, shoot first and ask questions later, where, and just in that statement, right? If we bring in Mercury into that, Mercury is going to be asking questions, it's going to be like, well, why this? Why that? What's going on here? What is this about? Why, what's going on? And the ability to then bring in, because it almost brings in that opposite point of Libra, right? It brings in some air. It brings in the ability to say, hey, let's ask a question. Asking of a question means that there is not an instinctual movement forward like the Mars would do with Aries.
So what is it? How were these rulerships determined?
Great question. So there's a lot of this book, but one of the things that I really appreciate, I came from a teaching called the Michael teaching. I don't know if you've ever heard about it. It was kind of presented in this book called Messages from Michael back in the 80s. And it's kind of like a light version of esoteric work. And So a lot of it is channeled. A lot of it has been channeled through Alice Bailey. And what I like about the basic statement in the beginning of each of the books is take what works for you, find what it is that has value, see, and they say it even throughout the book, see if this works for you, go out, practice this, and see what you experience in relationship to it. So it's very much about what I consider like resonance patterns, basically. So how resonance works, how certain planets in certain positions are going to create certain outcomes, especially when you start coming from a viewpoint that isn't based in survival. When you start having, some would say the luxury, whether of time, money, or space to be able to study and do these things, because if you're worrying about how you're going to eat and where you're going to live, or you're living somewhere like Ukraine, where there's war going on, the ability to be in that space is can be highly compromised. So it really kind of entails a certain level of being able to have that space and having that time, but also realizing that we're still here in the physical plane having these experiences.
So presumably the esoteric rulerships naturally also bring in the outer planets.
What I like to, so like, and I'm trying to think of, so like one of them is bringing, so for Pisces, and when you hear this, I mean, some of these will actually make energetic sense when you hear, at least they did for me. And one of them is, Pisces, the esoteric ruler is Pluto. And when you think about it, why wouldn't it be the last planet in our solar system, as far as like what we astrologers call our last planet, right? we don't get into the astronomy of Pluto at this time, but as far as like the intensity of it, and then also a few of the signs actually have the same planet on the personality level as on the esoteric level. So Leo and Capricorn, Leo with the sun. And when you think about it, when you hear about it, it's like Leo can, through its excitement and its desire to be seen, can burn people. But when Leo learns how to regulate itself, and it learns to come up into the heart chakra, which esoteric esoteric work has to deal with this idea that that spirit is matter at its least dense, and matter is spirit at its most dense. And when you think of a triangle coming up from down below, from the earth coming up as a physical form, and spirit coming down, that's how we incarnate, how we actually go into the meat of our physicality. And that center point is really our heart. And so when a Leo operates from conscious love, it's a whole different experience of what that audience is receiving. It's a whole different frequency of light. The same thing like with Capricorn. When Capricorn's coming from this place of being a Saturnian rule-oriented being, as opposed to someone who, one of the things for Saturn with esotericism is it has the rings pass not, meaning that you can't really go beyond where you are, that that there are inherent spiritual limitations that we have in place that kind of make sure that we don't, we may have, humans have a lot of hubris, right? Saturn is that planet which regulates hubris in humanity. And so when we try to push beyond where it is that we're able to do, we usually get some sort of a comeuppance or some sort of an experience that makes us have to go back in within ourselves, hopefully, and realize what work we really have to do inside of ourselves so that we can actually attain those goals in a healthy manner that not only benefit us, but also benefit the greater good.
So Capricorn and Leo retain their traditional rulership. We know that Aries is linked with Mercury and Pisces is linked with Pluto. What about the others? Tell us about the others.
The others, let's see. I am actually, because let's see. So if we go on to Taurus, so the other thing that I actually have to say is the interesting thing with esoteric astrology is there are 2 extra planets encountering with esoteric astrology. So first, and actually when you hear it again, I mean, it's these things that make sense, right? What is this planet we live on? right? We know in astrology, we don't talk about the earth. I mean, it's almost kind of a given. It's that center point where we all walk every day. But in esoteric astrology, earth is 180 degrees away from wherever your sun is located. And when you think about it, it's where we have our dharma. It's a thing, when you think about it, it's the polar opposite, our polarity for our sun. That part that always makes it go, oh, I don't like, I'm an Aquarian, like, oh, I can't be like a Leo. I can't be like, I don't want to be out there and be seen and everything. But every one of the signs is a little bit of a closeted version of the opposite sign, right? And so what I like about it is the sense of, like, if we ground ourselves in and understand that we have to incorporate this seeming polarity. And what I like to think about is like this seesaw that learns how to find the balance along the greatest continuation from absolute black to the lightest black, which is white, and vice versa, in response to whatever life is presenting. That's really the goal of what these oppositional or these polarizing energies are. And so if we ground ourselves in that opposite sign, we're never sitting in this thing of like projecting all that onto other people. We're owning it within ourselves, and we're able to do it. So and when you think about it, and here's how it kind of makes sense too. So here's Dharma and Earth. Well, what sign would that be really great for? Arrows in the air. And on the personality level or the traditional level, I shoot my arrows in the air and I don't really care where they hit, and I don't care where they fall. But on the esoteric level, I shoot my arrows in the air. I know where they're going to hit, and I do care, because they need to be grounded and they need to be intentionally based, going in there to create the space for giving someone higher sense of understanding and devotional experiences. All right, so if we go in order, so we got Aries is Mercury. Taurus is the other new little planet known as Vulcan. Vulcan is a spiritual planet that resides somewhere between Mercury and the sun. I'm not going to get into the scientifics of whether it really exists or not, because that's where I'm not going to hang my cross on that one. But what I like about it is oh my God, there's just so many different nuances of all of it. So there's sacred planets and non-sacred planets. Vulcan is a sacred planet, whereas Pluto is a non-sacred planet, but they both have to deal with a level of destruction of that which no longer serves. So Taurus, the sign of me, mine, mine-itis, it's sign of like toddlerism, like everything it sees at once for itself, because it gives it great pleasure and wants to have a lot of wonderful earthly material experiences and possessions. Vulcan comes in and says, life isn't about physicality. Life isn't about these, collecting these items. You're here to have soul experience. So we're going to take away, just like how Pluto would be called the great and terrible simplification. Vulcan is the ancient god who would take the other god's weapons to his anvil, because he was a godsmith. I mean, a godsmith. Oh, that's really funny. Godsmith. I like that. A blacksmith who was a god. And he would be able to, he perfected their weaponry, making sure that, whatever it was, like, making a sword that would actually cut through anything, or arrows that would reach their perfect point, meaning their target, the perfect target point, as well as obviously having a perfect point. So that's Taurus. Gemini, who wants to go around in Mercury and gather and maybe see a gemstone as being many different facets that are not one whole thing. Gemini is ruled by Venus, which wants to seek holism and see things in its entirety. So whenever I see Venus in Gemini, I always think, oh, here's the possibility. That's the other thing. Whenever I see any of the rulerships, the esoteric rulerships in people's charts, I always think, oh, there's an opportunity for these people to be operating in that soul-centered energy in their lives. So Venus is like not going to go around and create a lot of just like busy energy. It's that Venus is going to kind of bring things together and see things as a holistic aspect. Cancer moves from the moon to Neptune. So there's this transcendental love and acceptance, from the simple. And they also talk about the moon veiling Neptune. And we'll talk about the moon in a second when we get up to Virgo. Fifth line is Leo. We talked about that with the sun being on both levels. Sixth sign of Virgo. So the interesting thing with the moon in esoteric astrology is it's considered a dead planet. And which in a way, when we think about it, there's like talk about it actually being kind of that in a sense as well, or whether it was like a meteor that came off, or whether it's a big old chop that came off Earth and then made it. But the idea is then when you also think about from the Cancerian standpoint, it's that well house of emotional history that may no longer serve the self. Because Cancer has to deal with the clan and the way the family does things, if we continue doing the same things we did in the past, then we're not going to evolve, kind of in a fundamental way. So that's Virgo, and then we go to 7, which is Libra. The esoteric ruler is Uranus, and Uranus represents this idea of synthesis. So it's not taking in this position of one side or another, but realizing that most things are a multifaceted complexity, and how to synthesize it into a synthetic whole. Scorpio is another one of the signs. It's the third sign that has the same rulership on both levels. It's Mars. So on the personality level, we know that Scorpio can be very lined up with getting its own needs met. But when its desire nature is used as a way to, because Mars in the esoteric level, when you see that the arrow at the top of the Mars glyph, it's an insertion. It creates space for something to be born. And so with Scorpio, I personally believe that one of the aspects with Scorpio is bringing these seemingly shadow-oriented topics into the light of day. Those of us, I'm a Scorpio moon, those of us with strong Scorpio or Pluto aspects are very much sought out by people, but not in a way that people really want them to know that it's being sought out, right? It's like you're going to see someone. I mean, it's lately like I've been calling in, and I think because I was raised Catholic, it makes it very easy for me. But it's like we're kind of like grand confessors, and so there's just the energy where it just opens. And so I think that Mars can just like kind of it opens people up, and if they're ready, there's just a way that it pierces the person, and then they're able to like release all of whatever it is that is no longer worth it. It's almost like puncturing a boil, I think is kind of like what I'm kind of wanting to say, but without saying it, because it's not a pretty image. But a lot of us have energetic boils that do need a bit of release. So let's see. So that was Scorpio, and then we go to Sagittarius, and they said Sagittarius is Earth, so it's that grounded sense, because Sagittarius can be so lofty and idealistic and off on the newest crusades without really understanding where it's going off to. Capricorn we talked about earlier with the Saturn being on both levels. And then Aquarius, which is my astro theater imagery of moon in Aquarius. But the esoteric ruler for Aquarius is Jupiter. And what I love about that kind of a sense, and each one of those is like they have a different level. One thing I haven't talked about, and I won't really get into because it's a whole other level, but there are also what are called energetic rays, and each one of the planets represents a ray. Jupiter and the sun are both share the same ray, and it's the ray of love. And being an Aquarian myself and understanding that, I love humanity, but I often don't like people, one of those aspects, that's such a, Saturn and Uranus are very cold, dry planets. I mean, they're not warm and loving. Jupiter, is really going to be a little bit more loving depending on what sign it's in. But in Aquarius, it gives this sense of, loving acceptance of humanity and holding a larger sense of philosophy, and again that inclusionary energy and aspect. I'm excited to see like what's going to be happening now with Pluto in Aquarius, Jupiter activating over here from Taurus as it's getting ready to move into pretty shortly, and with Uranus already being there. It's with having the esoteric ruler Jupiter, and then the modern ruler Uranus, both in Taurus, squaring Aquarius. I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of what gets awakened. And then a Pisces, I said, of course, earlier, is moving from that Jupiter, Neptune, and then on into Pluto, where it gets in that sense of really releasing and letting go. Because as we understand, as we get, the signs are all sort of developmental in a way. And so when you get into those last three signs, you're really getting into a transcendental aspects of ourselves, these parts that aren't necessarily limited to our personal viewpoints and our personal understandings. It's where fate meets us, right? It's like where life engages us in ways that we literally have no control.
You mentioned earlier that there were sacred and non-sacred planets. Tell us about that.
So the sacred and the non-sacred planets, as far as like how I see them, is it's a bit of where we so if we think of Pluto and Vulcan together, it's this idea of, first of all, that usually the sacred planets aren't really operating for an individual until they start working on themselves on a conscious level. And there's also this interesting way that they look about it, is that the wheel itself turns differently based on the way your process is working. So as you know, this is always like so confusing for me, because it's not like how our heads really kind of operate. But when we look at an astrological chart, the signs are all moving in a clockwise manner, but the planets are moving in a counterclockwise manner. But when they say that you step onto the, say, like the fixed cross or the cardinal cross, it's it's kind of like this idea that you're creating new rules of engagement. You're no longer being ruled by things in a certain way. Like Saturn, they talk about, you're no longer ruled by Saturn's rings. You have an authority over yourself. It's something that sometimes I just barely had my second Saturn return, so I'm kind of like feeling a little bit of what that might be. It's like once you really understand what the rules are of your life, you begin to understand how you can paint outside the lines, and how you can take the rules and make them work. And it kind of fits into my work with the astrological mavericks, this idea that some of us are really here to influence and change the way people perceive the world. And it can be a shaming experience for those of us having it, because it's really pushing people in a way that people don't like to be pushed.
So then how does that link with the notion of some planets being sacred and some not?
So with that, in the sense of it really depends on what your focus is. I mean, if you're kind of operating your life in a personality centered way, then probably each of the non-sacred planets is going to be operating a little bit more, as well as a little bit more of the esoteric rulership isn't going to be playing that much on it. But where you're going to want to be looking for those sorts of things is where either the esoteric ruler and the traditional ruler are in aspect with one another, or the sacred and the non-sacred planets are in relationship to one another. Kind of will show you the rules of engagement of how the personality is going to have an experience of unfolding itself into its soul-centered lifetime. There's so many different ways each of us experience soul. I mean, some people can be born and really be, like when you think of like the Dalai Lama, they went around to different people, different children, and they laid out these different objects that were owned by the previous, or not owned, but were experienced by the previous Dalai Lama. And then they see like how there's that resonance pattern. And so it is with, kind of like this way of how we operate in life. And so we're either operating from that standpoint of coming in with that consciousness, or through transits and progressions, having that gradually unfold, or some of us who are very stubborn and have a hard time having crises happen, especially like when you think about it, any of the outer planets making aspects of the angles, there are these awakening moments that happen in people's lives where it's like, oh my God, I've had this spiritual experience my whole life, but I've been trying to like push being like working in a corporate job, you realize like, oh my God, my round self is never going to fit in the square peg of a corporate structure. These sorts of things where we begin having these awarenesses, or, I can't live in a city anymore because there's way too much psychic fog that goes on. And I really need to be in a place where there's space and energy for me to be contemplating these deeper things about life. maybe I need to like move out of my relationship. You realize all of a sudden, oh, this is the relationship I found myself in for the last 30 years, or whatever cycle typically that happens. And you go like, oh, I've done this and I'm done with that part of it. Now I need to go and move into this new part. And then that's when you're going to see more of that, the sacred planet kind of kicking in a little bit, as well as the soul-centered rulers for each one of those.
So are you saying then that each planet can be sacred and non-sacred depending on how it's being experienced?
I would say in that standpoint, there's the difference between the soul-centered ruler and the traditional ruler. So in that sense, I would say that's where the difference of how the planet might be getting used. So when I'm talking to a client, when I'm doing a session, I'm going to be sort of, and if they've asked me for an esoteric reading, then it's very clear I'm going to be working on that the whole time. But a lot of other times when I'm doing like a traditional reading, I'm going to be kind of asking some questions of people in such a way that's going to be telling me how that Venus is working, if that's giving them a sense of working with their Gemini, like maybe they have a Gemini North node, and then I look and I see that there's a trine or a sextile to Venus, then I might sit there and go like, so, how are your values operating when you're working with people? Are you looking at people and holding them all in these separate little silos, or are you seeing people in this more holistic standpoint and like seeing them more as like an energetic counsel for yourself? Might be one way of playing with it. I might look at someone and talk about, so like when it comes to a sacred and a non-sacred planet, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of another, oh my gosh. And sometimes it's like, because I don't use them so often. So it's like hard for me to, but I think it's really easy for me when I look at it. It's like Pluto and Vulcan are one of the, let's see if Earth would be the sacred, it's 5th level. Yeah. So Earth is a non-sacred and Venus is a sacred planet. They're both what's called 5th ray. And so, no, I got that wrong too. Sorry. I need to look those up as well. I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
But you can see, I mean, it's kind of a very complex cosmology, and there are nuances throughout. And so it really is going to depend on who you're talking to and what it is that they're presenting in relationship to it, as far as like how those sacred and or esoteric rulerships are going to be showing up. I mean, if someone's coming to me and they're talking to me about their spiritual practice, if they're talking to me about how they're moving into this next phase of their life, not wanting to carry old baggage with them in a way that isn't, where they're not having the attachments, where they're not, drama is like a very key thing, so when we talk about being personal, the impersonal, and impersonal, the personal, when you step onto a more spiritually oriented lifetime, drama should be really slowly or quickly stepping away out of your life, because if there's drama going on, then that means that there's attachments, energetic things that are going on that haven't been cleared out yet.
Indeed, yes. Well, what drew you to this side of astrology?
It's very interesting. Like I said earlier, I was back in the 80s. I learned about the Michael teaching, which is this idea that's very much like the esoteric. But what I like about it is it's again this kind of difference between the personality and the soul centered, because in the Michael teaching it talks about you reach this last lifetime and then it's very Taoist, and then you go back to the all that is. Whereas the esoteric teaching is a little more almost Buddhist in a sense. And what I liked about it, it kind of in a way is encapsulated in the sense of Kuan Yin, who's like, for me, like holds a lot of power in this idea of ultimate compassion and mercy, of remaining until the last soul returns to nirvana. There's a very different understanding in that, right? It's like me first, right? Getting back to the all that is versus like, hey, you know what? We are all in this together. And if there's anything that everyone on this planet needs to start understanding, is that we really literally are all in this together. So what brought me to it years ago was I'm working with Alan Oken, who has done a lot of work on esoteric astrology. Unfortunately, he just passed away this last year from COVID. And I have to admit, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but whenever I picked up Alice Bailey, in fact, he gave me a book called Serving Humanity. And I really love the idea. It's one of those things I say with all my clients every time I say, I'm here to be of service to you. So it's one of my taglines. I started reading this book. I'd read a paragraph and I'd like put it down. I'd read a paragraph and I'd put it down. And finally, the third time I picked it up, I took it, walked it outside to my trash can, and I threw it in the trash can. Because it just literally, you know, because it's this Edwardian, Victorian, obfuscating language. It takes paragraphs to describe things that can be simply communicated in a sentence. And they are mystery school information. So, I mean, you don't really energetically want anyone having access to it. And yet, I don't think it needs to be as convoluted as it is. So fast forward a little while, and Alan's here in Santa Fe doing a workshop for his 70th birthday, and he invites me to sit in on one of his esoteric teaching classes. Well, all of a sudden, it was like a primer, like something in me, like the key clicked, and all of a sudden we were channeling back and forth. Part of the esoteric thing is this idea of the new world servers. And then all of a sudden I realized, like, oh yeah, I'm one of those. And, you know, and then he said, oh, well, I don't, you know, I know many, but the ones I don't know very much is there's ones called the synthesizers and da, da, da. And I'm like, oh, that's what I am. And he says, wait a minute, I'm just kidding that I know someone who died. And it was like this weird thing. And we weren't even talking, you know, so it began that. And then ever since then, I can read it and it goes, it connects in ways. And one thing that I think is very important in the process of understanding and learning esoteric astrology is you really have to have a good, strong foundation in traditional astrology. Otherwise, it's hard to land. Like when I've taught it for Kepler, I've had people like try and do that alongside learning astrology. And you're kind of like swimming in the deep end without a life, without, you know, any buoyancy. It can be really overwhelming.
Indeed. Let's have your website so that people can get in touch with you.
Sure. So I'm available here at coremichael.com. That's COREMICHAEL.com. And I also teach for Kepler. I was the past interim president for Kepler College, and I'm going to be teaching something on astrological mavericks, which are people who have planets on the angles or in the same sign as their angles, which is another powerful placement that gets for people. But yeah, I love astrology. There's just such, as you know, from doing all the webcasts, but podcasts you're doing and the work that you've done, it's such a nice wide range of information to be able to help us greatly understand ourselves and understand others in a way that isn't so personal.
Indeed. Well, I will be putting a link to your website in the description box so that people can find you easily. I myself am doing a course at the Kepler College with Marcus Patchett. Is coming up soon, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I think people should all be heading towards that website too to find out more. Along with my own website. So there's lots for viewers to explore. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today.
Have a great day.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at our changing times. Until then, have a great week and goodbye.